The snow fell silent and steady on the wooden roofs of Ash Hollow, each flake adding its weight to the growing burden of winter. Leona Jameson pulled her worn and wool shawl tighter around her shoulders as she trudged down the main street, her boots leaving deep impressions in the fresh powder. The cold bit through the thin fabric of her dress, but it was nothing compared to the emptiness in her stomach and the weight in her chest. She was 30 years old, though the mirror at the last way station had shown her a face that could have belonged to someone older. Her height, unusual for a woman, had once been an asset when she'd worked as a nurse with the wagon trains crossing Kansas. Those strong hands had delivered babies, set broken bones, and held the dying as they passed. Now they clutched at nothing but the frayed edges of her shawl. The theft at the depot had been swift and thorough. While she'd stepped away to help an elderly woman with her parcels, someone had made off with her travel bag, everything she owned except what she wore. The station master had shrugged, suggested she speak to the sheriff, but the sheriff was 2 towns over chasing cattle thieves. By the time he returned, she'd either have frozen or moved on. Ash Hollow wasn't where she'd planned to stop. It was supposed to be Council Bluffs, where her cousin had promised work at a millinery shop. But train fare required money, and money required work. And work seemed as scarce as warmth in this snow-locked town. The Riverside Inn was her first stop. Through the frost-etched window, she could see the glow of oil lamps and the shadows of people moving about in warmth and comfort. The proprietor, a thin man with suspicious eyes, looked her up and down when she inquired about a room. "Full up," he said, though she could see empty keys hanging on the board behind him. "Been full all week." She didn't argue. She'd learned that arguing with men who'd already made up their minds was like trying to convince the snow to fall upward. The fabric shop was closed, a handwritten sign in the window announcing the owner had gone to Denver for supplies. The general store was open, but the woman behind the counter took one look at Leona's travel-stained dress and height that rivaled most men, and her expression shuddered like a house preparing for a storm. "We're not hiring," she said before Leona could speak. "And we don't extend credit to folks passing through." "I'm not asking for credit," Leona said quietly. "Just looking for work. I can read, write, do figures. I can sew, cook." "I said we're not hiring." The woman's voice was sharp as winter wind. "Best try the saloon. They sometimes need help." The implication hung in the air between them. Leona straightened her spine. She still had that much pride left and walked out without another word. She'd starve before she'd work in a saloon. She'd seen what became of women who served drinks to lonely men in frontier towns. The Methodist church was locked. A notice on the door said the Reverend would return Tuesday, but today was only Saturday, and Leona doubted she'd last until Tuesday without shelter. House after house, shop after shop. The story was the same. Doors closed, sometimes politely, sometimes not. An elderly woman on Elm Street opened her door a crack, took one look at Leona's tall frame silhouetted against the falling snow, and shut it again with a sharp click of the lock. As the pale winter sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the snow-covered mountains a faint pink, Leona found herself at the edge of town. Her fingers had long since gone numb, and her steps had slowed to a shuffle. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, but it seemed even her willingness to beg wasn't enough to secure a corner to sleep in. An abandoned water trough stood near the old livery stable, its wooden sides silvered with age and neglect. The stable itself was empty, had been for months, by the look of it. Weeds poked through the snow around its foundation, and one door hung askew on rusted hinges, but the roof was mostly intact, and that was more than she'd found anywhere else. Leona sank down beside the trough, her back against its solid weight. The cold from the ground seeped through her thin dress immediately, but at least here she was out of the wind. She pulled her knees to her chest, trying to make herself smaller, trying to conserve what little warmth remained in her body. She wouldn't cry. Tears were another luxury, and they'd only freeze on her cheeks anyway. Instead, she stared at the lights beginning to twinkle in the windows of Ash Hollow. each one a small beacon of warmth and belonging that didn't include her. Somewhere, families were gathering around dinner tables. Somewhere, women were tucking children into warm beds. Somewhere, people had places where they belonged. But not here, not her, not anymore. The snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, covering her tracks as if she'd never walked through the town at all. Soon, she thought, she'd be just another drift along the forgotten edges of Ash Hollow, another casualty of winter and circumstance that no one would remember come spring. She closed her eyes. Not to sleep. Sleeping in this cold would be dangerous, but to rest them from the brightness of the snow. Behind her eyelids, she could almost pretend she was somewhere else, back in Kansas, perhaps in the wagon train's circle of protection, back when her skills mattered, when her height was strength instead of suspicion, when she had a purpose beyond merely surviving another night. The crunch of boots on snow made her open her eyes. For a moment, she thought she'd dozed off and was dreaming, because surely no one would be walking around the abandoned stable at this hour. But the sound came again, steady and deliberate, and a shadow fell across the snow in front of her. She looked up, squinting against the last light of day, ready to run if necessary, though she doubted her cold-stiffened legs would carry her far. But the man standing there made no threatening moves. He simply stood, observing her with eyes that seemed to take in everything: her worn dress, her desperate position, the way she tried to shrink back against the water trough, as if she could disappear into its weathered wood. He was tall, taller than her, which was unusual with broad shoulders that blocked out a good portion of the dying light. His coat was wool, well made but not fancy, and his hat shadowed most of his face, but she could see enough to know he wasn't from town. Something about the way he stood, patient and still as a fence post, marked him as a man more comfortable with open spaces than crowded streets. The man had been standing in the shadows behind the livery stable for the better part of an hour, watching the town go about its business of closing doors against the cold and strangers alike. Calder Boone had come to Ash Hollow for supplies: salt, flour, ammunition for the winter months ahead. His small ranch on the hillside was well stocked. But a man learned to prepare for the unexpected when he lived alone 5 miles from his nearest neighbor. He'd finished his business at the general store just as the tall woman entered. Something about the way she held herself straight-backed, despite the obvious weariness in her steps, made him pause in the doorway. He'd watched Mrs. Henderson's face close up like a trap, heard the sharp dismissal, seen the way the woman's shoulders had stiffened before she turned and walked out with her dignity intact. Calder wasn't one for involving himself in other folks' troubles. 36 years of living had taught him that most problems sorted themselves out without his interference. But something kept him watching as the woman made her way down Main Street, stopping at each establishment only to be turned away. He knew the signs of someone at the end of their rope. He'd seen it in soldiers after the war, in homesteaders after drought took their crops, in his own mirror after Sarah had died of fever 6 years back. It was in the careful way she moved, conserving energy she didn't have, in the way she no longer bothered to brush the snow from her shawl, in the way she'd looked at that abandoned stable like it was a palace. From his position, he'd observed every rejection: the riverside inn that mysteriously had no rooms, the church with its locked doors, even old Mrs. Garrett, who prided herself on her Christian charity, had shut her door in the woman's face. He'd noticed something else too: the way men's eyes followed her, not with the usual appreciation for a handsome woman, but with suspicion. She was too tall, too strong-looking, too alone. In a town like Ash Hollow, that made her dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with actual threat. When she'd finally sunk down beside the water trough, Calder had made up his mind. Not out of pity, he could see she'd spit that back in his face, but out of something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the way she hadn't cried. Maybe it was the way she'd arranged herself to block the wind. Still thinking, still planning, still surviving. Or maybe it was just that he remembered what it felt like to have nowhere to go on a cold night. He approached slowly, making sure his boots crunched loud enough in the snow to announce his presence. No sense startling her. When she looked up at him, he saw what he'd expected: wariness, exhaustion, and underneath it all, a spark of something that hadn't quite been extinguished by the town's cold welcome. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Calder noticed things in that silence. Her eyes were gray, the color of winter sky before snow. Her hands, even mittened, showed the kind of strength that came from work, not breeding. There was a faint scar along her jawline, old and silvered. She'd been pretty once, probably still was under the trail dust and desperation, but pretty had been worn down to something more: useful endurance. She didn't speak, didn't beg, didn't try to explain her circumstances, just watched him with those steady gray eyes and waited. That, more than anything, decided him. "I've got a place," he said, his voice rusty from a day of not using it. "It's not fancy, just a ranch house about 5 miles north, but it's got walls and a roof and a stove that draws proper." Something flickered across her face: hope, maybe, or just deeper wariness. "What's the cost?" she asked, and her voice was lower than he'd expected, hoarse from cold. "No cost. I'm offering shelter, not a trade." She studied him more intently now, taking his measure the way he'd taken hers. He stood still for it. Let her look. He knew what she'd see: a man who'd worked too many years in sun and wind, whose clothes were clean but mended, whose boots were good but not new. A man alone. Which was its own kind of suspicion in a territory where most folks clustered together for safety and sanity. "Why?" she asked finally. It was a fair question. Calder considered his words carefully. "Because I've got space and you need it. Because I watched this town turn its back on you for no reason other than you're alone and female. Because my mother would rise from her grave and box my ears if I left any woman to freeze when I had the means to prevent it." A ghost of something that might have been a smile touched her lips. "Your mother sounds formidable." "She stood about as tall as you. Come to think of it, scared most men and half the women in Missouri before we came west." The woman struggled to her feet, stiff with cold. Calder didn't offer to help. He could see she needed to do this herself. When she was standing, she looked him direct in the eye. They were nearly of a height, him having maybe 2 inches on her. "I can work," she said. "I won't take charity. I can cook, clean, tend animals. We'll sort that out tomorrow. Tonight, let's just focus on getting you somewhere warm before you catch your death." She hesitated. He could see the war in her face need battling with caution, pride wrestling with practicality. "I don't even know your name." "Calder Boone. I run cattle on a small spread north of here. Been there 6 years, and folks in town will tell you I keep to myself but pay my debts and don't bother anyone who doesn't bother me first." They didn't seem inclined to tell me much of anything. "No, I don't suppose they did." He pulled off one glove and extended his hand. "And you are?" She looked at his hand for a moment before taking it. Her grip was firm despite the cold. "Leona Jameson, recently of Kansas. Before that, Nebraska. Before that, points east." "Well, Miss Jameson." "A Mrs. Jameson," she corrected quietly. "Widow." He nodded, filing that information away. "Mrs. Jameson. My wagon's at the general store. If you're willing to trust a stranger on a cold night, I can offer you better shelter than this stable." She looked back at the abandoned building, then at the lights of Ash Hollow, where not a single door had opened for her. When she turned back to him, her decision was made. "I suppose I've trusted worse men for worse reasons," she said. Calder almost smiled at that. "That's not exactly a ringing endorsement, but I'll take it." They walked back through town in silence, her struggling to keep pace with cold, stiffened limbs, him shortening his stride without making it obvious. A few curtains twitched as they passed, and he knew there'd be talk tomorrow. Calder Boone, who hadn't so much as tipped his hat to a woman since his wife died, walking through town with a stranger. Let them talk. They usually did anyway. His wagon was where he'd left it, supplies already loaded and covered with canvas. His horses, 2 sturdy bays, shifted restlessly in their traces. They knew the way home and were eager for their barn. "Can you climb up, or do you need a hand?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. She gripped the wagon's side and hauled herself up with determination, if not grace. "I can manage." He climbed up beside her, released the brake, and clicked to the horses. They moved out eagerly, breath steaming in the cold air. As they passed the riverside inn, he noticed the proprietor watching from the window. Calder touched his hat brim in mock courtesy, and had the satisfaction of seeing the man step back quickly. The road north was rough but passable, the snow not yet deep enough to cause real trouble. Calder kept his eyes on the path, letting the silence settle between them like another blanket. She sat rigid beside him, hands clenched in her lap, looking straight ahead. He didn't try to make conversation. Words could wait for warmth and walls. After a mile or so, she spoke. "I should tell you I have no money. Nothing to pay you with except work." "I'm not looking for payment." "Men always want payment. Mr. Boone, one kind or another." There was weight behind those words, the kind that came from hard experience. Calder kept his voice easy. "Only payment I'm interested in is maybe some help with morning coffee. I make it strong enough to float a horseshoe, and it's been suggested more than once that I'm trying to poison folks." The ranch house appeared through the falling snow like something conjured from the darkness, solid, square, and blessedly real. It wasn't much to look at, just a single-story structure of logs and chinking with a stone chimney sending a promise of warmth into the night sky. But to Leona, it might as well have been a castle. Calder pulled the wagon up to the barn first, and she watched as he efficiently unhitched the horses, rubbed them down, and saw them settled with hay and water. He worked with the easy rhythm of long practice, his movements sure despite the dim light from the single lantern. She'd offered to help, but he'd waved her toward the house instead. "Door's not locked. Get the stove stoked up, there should be embers still. I'll be along directly." She'd hesitated at the threshold, overwhelmed suddenly by the trust implicit in sending a stranger into his home alone. When was the last time anyone had trusted her with anything? But the cold made the decision for her, driving her inside where the promise of warmth waited. The interior was exactly what she'd expected from a man living alone, functional, clean enough, but lacking any softness. A main room served as kitchen, dining, and living space, with 2 doors leading off it that she assumed were bedrooms. The furniture was handmade but sturdy, a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the stove, shelves holding dishes and supplies, no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no pictures on the walls. It was shelter stripped to its essence. She found the wood box and carefully added fuel to the dying embers in the stove, coaxing them back to life with the patience of someone who'd tended many fires in many places. By the time Calder came in, stamping snow from his boots, the stove was beginning to radiate blessed heat. He looked around, seemed satisfied with what he saw, and hung his coat on a peg by the door. "Coffee?" he asked, already reaching for the pot. "I can make it," she offered quickly. "You've done enough." "Sit," he said, not unkindly. "You're dead on your feet, and I know where everything is." She sat because her legs were trembling now that the warmth was reaching them, pins and needles of returning circulation making her grit her teeth. While he worked at the stove, she studied the room more carefully. Everything had its place. She noticed. Tools hung on specific pegs, dishes stacked just so. The floor was swept clean, the windows free of grime despite the lack of curtains. A man who valued order, then she could respect that. "Are you hungry?" he asked over his shoulder. "I've got beans and salt pork, some biscuits from yesterday." Her stomach clenched at the mention of food, but pride made her hesitate. "I don't want to take—" Mrs. Jameson." He turned to face her, holding the coffee pot. "If we're going to get along, we need to establish something. When I offer something, I mean it. I'm not keeping score, and I'm not looking to put you in my debt. Now, are you hungry or not?" "Yes," she admitted quietly. "Very—" He nodded and went back to his preparations. Soon, the smell of warming food filled the small space, and Leona found herself fighting tears again. When had she last sat in a warm kitchen while someone prepared food for her? Not since Thomas died. Certainly, on the wagon trains. She'd always been the one doing the tending, the feeding, the caring for others. Calder set a plate in front of her beans. Pork, 2 biscuits, and a cup of coffee that did indeed look strong enough to float a horseshoe. "Eat," he said, taking his own plate to the other chair. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind. Leona forced herself to eat slowly despite her hunger, aware of his occasional glances. The food was simple but good, seasoned well. The biscuits still soft enough to sop up the bean juice. The coffee was brutal, but it was hot and drove the last of the cold from her bones. When she'd cleaned her plate, he wordlessly served her more, ignoring her weak protest. This time she ate more slowly, finally full enough to think clearly. "About sleeping arrangements," she began, setting down her fork. He was already shaking his head. "You'll take the bedroom. I'll take the chair here by the stove." "I can't put you out of your bed. I've slept on floors before." "I don't doubt it," he interrupted. "But you won't sleep on mine. The bedroom's through there." He indicated the door to the left. "There's a basin for washing, and I'll heat some water. Privy's out back, about 20 yards from the door." "I'm Mr. Boone."
"It's not a discussion. Mrs.
Jameson. I didn't bring you here to have you sleep on the floor like a dog. You'll take the bed, and that's the end of it." She studied his face, searching for the catch, the expectation, the price that would come due later. But all she saw was a kind of stubborn decency that reminded her painfully of Thomas in their early days. Before the war had carved pieces out of him, he never got back. "Why?" she asked again, as she had by the water trough.
"You don't know me. I could be anyone. Could have done anything."
He leaned back in his chair, considering. "Maybe that's true. But I know what I saw today. I saw a woman who kept her dignity when doors slammed in her face, who sat down to freeze rather than take work that would compromise her principles, and yes, I heard what Mrs. Henderson suggested, who didn't beg, didn't plead, didn't try to manipulate me with tears or promises." He stood, gathering the plates. "Seems to me a woman like that deserves a bed for the night without having to earn it on her back or her knees." The bluntness of his words should have shocked her, but instead she found them oddly comforting. He saw the situation clearly, without prettying it up or dancing around it. "One night," she said carefully. "Tomorrow I'll look for work. Find somewhere else. Tomorrow we'll see what tomorrow brings. For now, let's get through tonight." He heated water while she sat by the stove, drowsiness beginning to creep over her now that she was warm and fed. When he carried the steaming basin to the bedroom, she followed, stopping in the doorway to take in the space that would be hers for the night. It was as spare as the main room, a bed with a simple iron frame, a dresser with a mirror, a trunk at the foot of the bed. But the quilts looked warm, and the mattress didn't sag. And it was more than she'd had in weeks. "There's a nightshirt in the drawer if you need it," he said, setting the basin on the dresser. "Was my wife's. Never could bring myself to throw it out."
"I couldn't—"
"She would have wanted it used," he said simply. "Sarah was practical that way." He left her then, closing the door quietly behind him. Leona stood for a moment in the strange room, listening to him moving around in the main space, banking the stove, settling into the chair. Then she washed quickly, found the nightshirt soft flannel, smelling of cedar, and changed into it. It was too short, of course, but it was clean and warm. The bed, when she finally climbed into it, was almost painful in its comfort. She'd been sleeping rough for so long that the softness of a real mattress, the weight of proper quilts, seemed foreign. She lay rigid, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling, the wind outside, the creak of the rocking chair in the other room. She should sleep. She was exhausted enough. But her body, trained by too many dangerous nights, wouldn't relax. Every sound could be a threat. Every creak could be footsteps approaching. She'd accepted his hospitality because freezing to death had seemed the only alternative. But now, in the dark, all the warnings she'd lived by came flooding back. Never trust strange men. Never put yourself in their power. Never believe in kindness without cost. But as the hours passed and nothing happened, no doorknob turning, no floorboards creaking with stealthy approach, no sudden weight on the bed, she began to slowly, carefully, relax. From the other room came the sound of steady breathing, the occasional shift of weight in the chair. He was keeping watch. She realized. Not over her, but for her. Protecting the door, the entrance, the safety of the space he'd offered. When had anyone last stood guard while she slept? For the first time in months. Leona Jameson closed her eyes and let herself truly rest. While snow continued to fall outside and a strange man kept watch in a rocking chair, asking nothing in return but the promise that she'd use the bed instead of the floor. The smell of bacon and coffee woke her, drifting under the bedroom door like a gentle summons. For a moment, Leona lay still, disoriented by the softness beneath her and the warmth around her. Then memory returned the cold, the closed doors, the silent man who'd offered shelter without conditions. Pale winter light filtered through the frost-etched window. She'd slept later than she had in months, the exhaustion of weeks on the road finally catching up when she'd found a safe place to rest. But now, embarrassment heated her cheeks. What kind of woman slept until daylight while her host made his own breakfast? She dressed quickly in her travel-worn clothes, folding the borrowed nightshirt carefully and placing it back in the drawer. Her hair was a tangle, but she did her best to pin it up respectably. When she finally opened the bedroom door, she found Calder at the stove, his back to her, working with the same quiet efficiency she'd observed the night before. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee's ready if you want it." She moved to the table, noting that he'd already set 2 places. The domesticity of it made her throat tight. "I'm sorry. I should have been up to help." "No should about it." He turned, carrying a skillet. "You needed the sleep. Sit." She sat, watching as he divided bacon and eggs between their plates. His movements were sure but careful, and she noticed he gave her the larger portion. When he sat across from her, she caught his eye. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded, understanding she meant more than just breakfast. They ate quietly, the only sounds the clink of forks on plates and the pop of wood in the stove. The food was good, better than good. The eggs were cooked through but not rubbery, the bacon crisp without being burned. A man who'd learned to feed himself well despite being alone. "You cook better than most women I know," she observed. "Had to learn. Sarah was many things, but a cook wasn't one of them. Near burned down the kitchen twice before I took over." A ghost of a smile touched his lips at the memory. She said God gave her healing hands, not cooking ones, and she wasn't about to argue with the Almighty's decision. She was a healer, midwife, learned from her mother back in Ohio, delivered half the babies in the county before the fever took her. Leona's hands stilled on her cup. "I was a nurse, with the wagon trains." His eyebrows rose slightly, the first real surprise she'd seen from him. "That explains the steady hands. And why you looked familiar. Did you come through here maybe 3 years back, big train headed for Oregon?" She thought back. "Yes, we stopped for supplies. I remember treating a boy for a broken arm." "The Henderson boy. Mrs. Henderson's nephew." His mouth twisted wryly. "Same woman who suggested you try the saloon yesterday." "Ah." Leona took another sip of the brutal coffee. "I suppose she didn't remember." "More likely didn't want to. Easier to turn away a stranger than someone who helped your kin." They finished eating, and Leona rose to clear the dishes. This time he didn't protest. Just showed her where things went. She heated water and washed up while he tended the stove and checked the wood supply. They worked around each other easily, as if they'd been sharing the space longer than one night. When the kitchen was set to rights, she dried her hands and faced him. I should go, see about finding work in town. In the same town that turned you out yesterday. He was pulling on his coat. That's pride talking, not sense. I can't impose on you. Who's imposing? I've got work needs doing, and you need work. Seems straightforward enough to me. She frowned. What kind of work? Fences down in the north pasture. Horses need tending. Cowshed needs mucking. Harness needs mending. I've been putting off washing clothes so long I'm about to turn them inside out and start over. He pulled on his gloves. I can't pay much, but there's room and board and a fair wage for fair work. You don't need to invent work for me. He turned to face her fully then, and his expression was serious. Mrs. Jameson, I've been running this place alone for 6 years. There's more work than one man can do and still stay ahead of it. I'm not inventing anything. Question is whether you're willing to do it. She studied him, looking for the trap, the hidden expectation, but his gray eyes were steady, patient. For how long? Long as it suits both of us, day by day, if that's how you want it. It was more than fair, more than she'd hoped for when she'd been sitting by that water trough. All right, show me what needs doing. He showed her the barn first. 4 horses occupied the stalls, the 2 bays from last night, and 2 riding horses, a gray mare and a black gelding. They need feeding twice a day. Stalls mucked regular. The mare's got a stone bruise, needs her hoofs soaked daily. You know horses. I do. She was already running her hands along the mare's neck, checking her over with experienced eyes. The horse leaned into her touch, starved for attention. Chickens are in the coop out back. They're good layers, but stupid as stones. Fox got 2 last week, so check for holes in the fence. He led her through the rest, the root cellar, the smokehouse, the well. Everything was functional but showed signs of deferred maintenance, a man juggling too many tasks alone. What about the house? She asked as they circled back. You can do as much or as little there as you see fit. I've been managing, but... He gestured vaguely at the bare windows, the plain walls. Sarah always said I'd be happy living in a cave as long as it had a sound roof. Back inside, he showed her where he kept supplies, the small stash of money for emergencies, the loaded rifle by the door. Can you shoot? Well enough to hit what I aim at. Good. Not much trouble out here, but it's best to be prepared. He paused at the door, seemed to wrestle with something. About sleeping arrangements. I'll fix up a bed in the barn. You'll do no such thing. The words came out sharper than she intended. I won't have you sleeping with the horses on my account. Then where? We're both adults. Mr. Boone. Surely we can manage to share a roof without scandal. You keep your room. I'll keep mine. And that's the end of it. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. If you're sure. I am. He left then to check his cattle, and Leona set about exploring her new domain more thoroughly. The house needed work. That was certain. Not just cleaning, but softening, warming. The bare functionality of it spoke of a man who'd given up on making a home as opposed to just a shelter. She found his clothing in a basket by his bedroom door, shirts and trousers, and union suits that did indeed need washing desperately. Rolling up her sleeves, she heated water and set to work. It felt good to have her hands busy again, to have a purpose beyond mere survival. As she worked, she found herself humming something she hadn't done in months. The tune was an old one her mother had sung while doing washing back in Pennsylvania, before the world had gotten so complicated. She stopped when she realized what she was doing, looked around the quiet kitchen as if someone might have heard. But there was only the snap of wood in the stove and the distant sound of cattle. No judgment, no suspicion, no calculating looks, just work to do and space to do it in. By the time Calder returned near dusk, she had washing strung on lines he'd rigged in the warmest corner of the main room. Had taken stock of the pantry and started bean soaking for tomorrow. Had even begun mending the harness with neat, small stitches. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the changes. His expression was unreadable, but when he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "You've been busy. You said there was work. I worked." He hung up his coat, moving carefully around the hanging clothes. "Find everything you needed." "Yes, though you're near out of soap. I'll need to make more soon." "You know how." She almost smiled. "Mr. Boone, I've been making soap since I was tall enough to stir the pot. Your lack of it tells me Sarah didn't teach you that particular skill." "No," he admitted. "I've been trading for it in town, but that requires going to town and dealing with the Misses Hendersons of the world." She understood without him having to explain. "Well, you've got ashes and fat plenty. Few days and we'll have enough soap to last the winter." He moved to the stove, checking the coffee pot out of habit. When he spoke again, his voice was gruff. "This is more than a day's wages worth of work." "Then it's good I'm staying more than a day, isn't it?" Their eyes met across the room, an understanding passing between them. Day by day. They'd agreed, but both of them knew, somehow, that this arrangement had already taken root in ways neither quite expected. The man arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Leona had begun working at the ranch. She was in the yard, stirring a pot of lye soap over an open fire, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. A rider was coming down the trail from town, his horse kicking up small clouds of dust in the cold air. Even from a distance, something about the way he sat his horse made her stomach tighten. She knew that kind of casual arrogance, the way some men moved through the world as if everything in it was theirs for the taking. Her hand moved instinctively toward the long wooden paddle she'd been using to stir the soap. As he drew closer, recognition hit her like a physical blow. Jake Tillman. She'd hoped never to see him again, had traveled hundreds of miles to be sure of it. But here he was, riding up to Calder's ranch as if he had every right to be there. He reined in a few yards from where she stood, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Well, Leona Jameson. Or should I say Leona Parker, hard to keep track of which name you're using these days. She kept her face carefully neutral, though her grip on the paddle tightened. "It's Jameson. Has been since I married." "Right, the soldier boy." Jake's smile was unpleasant. "Heard he didn't make it back from the war. Shame about that. Left you in quite a position, didn't it?" "What do you want, Jake?" He dismounted, taking his time, making a show of looking around the tidy yard, the well-maintained buildings. "Nice place. Doing well for yourself. I see. Though I have to wonder what Mr. Boone would think if he knew exactly who he'd taken in." Before she could respond, Calder emerged from the barn, drawn by the voices. He moved with his usual unhurried pace, but Leona noticed the way his hand rested casual-like near his hip, where she knew he often wore a gun. "Help you with something?" Calder's voice was polite but cool. Jake's smile widened. "Just passing through, recognized an old acquaintance and thought I'd stop to say hello." He looked between them, calculation in his eyes. "You must be Calder Boone. Heard in town you'd hired some help. Didn't realize it was someone I knew." "And you are?" "Jake Tillman. I run freight between here and Denver. Knew Mrs. Jameson back in Kansas. We traveled in the same circles." The pause before circles was deliberate, loaded with implication. Leona forced herself to remain still, to not react to the threat implicit in his words. Calder's expression didn't change. "Well, Mr. Tillman, Mrs. Jameson's past acquaintances are her business. Right now, she's got work to do, and I imagine you've got somewhere to be." Jake's smile faltered slightly. He'd clearly expected more of a reaction. "Just being neighborly. Thought you should know what kind of woman you've got working for you. See, back in Kansas, after her husband died, Leona here found herself in difficult circumstances. Had to make some compromises to survive. Worked in some establishments that weren't exactly respectable, if you take my meaning." The words hung in the air like smoke from the soap fire. Leona felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her chin up. She'd known this moment would come eventually. The past always found you, no matter how far you ran. Calder shifted slightly, placing himself between Jake and Leona in a way that looked casual but wasn't. "Mr. Tillman, I'm going to say this once. What Mrs. Jameson did or didn't do before she came to work here is no concern of mine. What matters is she's a hard worker who earns her wages honest. Now, unless you got business with me, I'll ask you to move along." Jake's face darkened. "Just trying to do you a favor. Boone, man ought to know who's under his roof, especially when he's living alone with her. People in town are already talking." "Are they?" Calder's voice had gone very quiet, which Leona was beginning to recognize as dangerous. "And what exactly are they saying?" "Oh, you know how folks talk. Bachelor rancher takes in a woman nobody knows, sets her up in his house, drawing their own conclusions about what kind of arrangement you've got. Then they've got too much time on their hands." Calder took a step forward. "Mrs. Jameson works for wages, same as any hand I might hire. She's got a room, I've got mine, and that's all there is to it. Anyone who says different is welcome to come say it to my face." Jake held up his hands in mock surrender. "No need to get touchy. Just thought you should know what you were getting into." He turned back to Leona, his eyes hard. "Good seeing you again. Leona, I'll be sure to let the folks back in Dodge City know you're doing well. I'm sure they'd love to hear where you ended up." The threat was clear. Leona felt something cold settle in her stomach. She knew exactly who he'd tell, and what kind of trouble that could bring to her doorstep. Jake mounted his horse, tipped his hat mockingly, and rode off at an easy pace. They stood in silence, watching until he disappeared over the rise. Only then did Leona realize she was trembling. "You want to tell me what that was really about?" Calder asked quietly. She turned back to her soap, stirring with more force than necessary. "He told you, I worked in places that weren't respectable. After Thomas died, after the money ran out, after I couldn't find work as a nurse because nobody wanted to hire a woman who'd touched too many dying men." The words came out bitter. I served drinks, nothing more. Kept the books sometimes. But in towns like Dodge City, working in any kind of saloon marks you." Jake was one of the regulars, always wanting more than drinks, always angry when I said no. "Is he going to be a problem?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Men like Jake are always problems. They don't like being told no, and they really don't like seeing women they think they own doing well without them." Calder was quiet for a moment. Then, "You planning to run?" The question caught her off guard. She'd been thinking exactly that, pack what little she had. Leave tonight. Get ahead of whatever trouble Jake might stir up. It's what she'd done before. What had kept her safe. She stopped, really looked at Calder for the first time since Jake had appeared. His expression was calm, patient, not judging, not calculating, just waiting for her answer. It's what I usually do when the past catches up. That what you want to do?" She thought about the last 3 weeks, the quiet mornings making coffee, the satisfaction of seeing the ranch running smoother with 2 pairs of hands, the way Calder said evening when he came in from the fields, the simple pleasure of having a place at a table, a purpose beyond mere survival. "No," she admitted, "but staying might bring you trouble. Jake wasn't wrong about people talking. And if he spreads stories about my past, Mrs. Jameson Leona." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something about the way he said it made her look up. "I told you the first night I don't keep score. You think you're the only one who's had to do things they're not proud of to survive? You think I haven't made compromises, haven't had moments I'd rather forget." He moved closer, still keeping respectful distance, but near enough that she could see the seriousness in his eyes. "I don't care if you served drinks in a saloon. I don't care if you did more than that, though I believe you when you say you didn't. I care that you show up every morning ready to work. I care that you've got my horses looking better than they have in years. I care that for the first time in 6 years, this place is starting to feel less like a cave and more like a home." The words were so unexpected, so simply honest, that Leona felt tears prick her eyes. "You don't know what you're risking. Men like Jake, they don't just make threats. And if people in town start believing his stories, then they'll believe them. Can't control what folks think or say." He turned to look out toward where Jake had disappeared. "But I can control who's welcome on my land, and Jake Tillman just used up his welcome." "Calder, you've got soap to finish," he said, his voice returning to its usual practical tone. "And I've got fence to mend. Whatever Tillman thinks he's going to do, it'll keep until tomorrow. Right now, there's work to do." He headed back to the barn, leaving her standing by the soap pot. Leona watched him go, something loosening in her chest. She'd been prepared for disgust, for judgment, for the cold dismissal she'd faced so many times before. Instead, he'd offered her the same steady acceptance he'd shown from the beginning. She turned back to her soap, stirring more gently now. The past had found her. Yes, but for the first time in years, she had something worth standing her ground for, and a man who seemed willing to stand there with her. As the afternoon wore on and the soap thickened properly, Leona made her decision. She wouldn't run, not this time. Whatever Jake Tillman thought he could do, whatever stories he spread, she'd face them here, in this place where she'd finally found work that mattered and a man who saw her as more than her worst moments. She just hoped that decision wouldn't cost Calder more than he was willing to pay. Spring arrived slowly in the valley, melting snow giving way to mud, then finally to green grass pushing through the damp earth. Leona had been at the ranch for 2 months now, and the place showed it. The windows sported new curtains she'd sewn from fabric Calder had brought from town, nothing fancy, just simple blue-checked cotton, but they softened the harsh light and made the rooms feel less stark. She'd claimed a corner of the kitchen for herbs, small pots lined up on a shelf Calder had built without being asked. Sage, thyme, and rosemary perfumed the air when she brushed past them. The bare walls now held a few things: a calendar, a mirror she'd found in the barn and polished back to brightness, a sampler she'd discovered in Sarah's trunk and carefully pressed flat again. "You don't mind?" she'd asked when she'd first hung it, the delicate stitching spelling out, "Home is where love abides." It was Sarah's mother's, Calder had said, studying it. "Sarah would be glad it's being displayed again." That was how he was about all the changes, quietly accepting, occasionally helping, never commenting directly but showing approval in small ways. When she'd mentioned the kitchen table wobbled, she'd come in from feeding chickens to find him planning down one leg. When she'd hung the washing lines permanently in the corner, he'd reinforced the hooks without saying a word. This morning, Leona was transplanting seedlings she'd started weeks ago: tomatoes, peppers, squash. The kitchen garden had been Sarah's domain, Calder had told her, abandoned these 6 years. But the fence was still sound, and the soil, when she'd worked it, was rich and dark. She was kneeling in the dirt, settling a tomato plant into its new home, when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. Her hand went instinctively to the trowel beside her, a poor weapon, but better than nothing. 3 riders came into view, and Leona's heart sank. Jake Tillman was in the lead, but he'd brought friends this time. She recognized one from Dodge City, Marcus Webb, a man who'd made his money in ways it was better not to examine too closely. The third was a stranger, young and trying to look dangerous. They reined up at the garden fence, Jake's smile wide and false. "Morning, Leona. Beautiful day for planting." She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. "Mr. Tillman, I thought Calder made it clear you weren't welcome here." "Now, that's not very neighborly. I just came by to continue our conversation from last time. Brought some friends who remember you from the old days." He leaned forward in his saddle. "See, I got to thinking. Here you are, living comfortable, working for a respectable rancher.
Meanwhile, there's folks back in Dodge who'd pay good money to know where you ended up. Folks you owe money to, if I recall. I paid my debts before I left. Did you, funny? That's not how Big Jim tells it. Says you skipped out owing him near $50 for room and board. That's theft. Way he sees it. It was a lie, and they both knew it. She'd paid Big Jim every cent, had the receipt to prove it, or would have, if it hadn't been in the bag that was stolen. But that didn't matter. Men like Jake didn't need truth when lies served better. "What do you want?" she asked flatly. His smile widened. "Well, now we're getting somewhere. See, I'm thinking you've got a good situation here. Shame if something happened to ruin it. If certain stories got around town, made their way to Mr. Boone's ears, man like him, pillar of the community. Wouldn't want his reputation tarnished by association. He already knows. Does he know everything about that night in Abilene? About why you really had to leave Kansas?" Jake's voice dropped, became intimate in a way that made her skin crawl. "I was there. Remember I saw what happened to that cowboy who got too rough with you? Self-defense, sure, but try explaining that to his friends. Or to the law." Leona felt cold despite the warm spring sun. That night in Abilene was something she'd tried to bury, to forget. A drunk cowboy who wouldn't take no for an answer, who'd cornered her in the alley behind the saloon. She'd done what she had to do to get away, but the man had friends, and she'd had to leave town that very night. "So, here's what's going to happen," Jake continued. "You're going to be nice to me and my friends when we come by. Maybe serve us some of that fine coffee you make. Share a meal. Be hospitable. In return, we keep our mouths shut about your colorful past." "And if I don't?" Marcus Webb spoke for the first time. "Then things get unpleasant. For you, for Boone, for this nice little ranch you've got here. Amazing how accidents happen. Fences get cut, cattle wander off, barns catch fire." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Leona's mind raced, calculating options, finding none that didn't end badly. She was so focused on the men in front of her that she didn't hear Calder approach until he spoke. "Gentlemen," his voice was calm as still water, "I believe I made myself clear about trespassing on my property." He stood at the corner of the house, rifle held casual but ready. Leona had never seen him move so quietly, appear so suddenly. There was something different about his stance. His expression, this wasn't the quiet rancher she'd come to know. This was someone who'd faced down threats before. Jake's hand moved toward his gun, but Calder's voice stopped him. "I wouldn't... See, you're assuming I'm just some cowpuncher who got lucky with land. But before I settled here, I spent 5 years wearing a badge in towns that make Dodge City look like a church picnic. I know men like you. Tillman. Knew plenty of them. Some I arrested, some I buried." The younger stranger shifted nervously in his saddle. Marcus Webb's eyes narrowed, reassessing. "Now," Calder continued, "you're going to turn those horses around and ride off my land. You're going to stay off, and you're going to forget whatever scheme you rode in here with. Because if I see any of you near my property again, or if I hear you've been spreading stories about Mrs. Jameson in town, we're going to have a different kind of conversation. The kind that ends with the territorial marshal asking questions about your business dealings. Webb, yes, I know who you are. Badge might be gone, but I've still got friends who wear them." "You're bluffing," Jake said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "And try me." Calder's smile was thin and dangerous. "I've been living quiet here because I choose to. But I can choose different if pushed. Ask yourself if whatever you think you can gain from this is worth finding out what kind of man I used to be." The silence stretched taut. Finally, Webb spoke. "Come on, Jake. Nothing here worth our time." Jake's face flushed with anger, but he wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he spat. "Yes," Calder said quietly. "It is." They rode off, and Calder stood watching until they were out of sight. Only then did Leona see the tension in his shoulders, the white-knuckle grip on the rifle. He'd been ready for violence. She realized. Ready and capable? "I'm sorry," she said into the quiet that followed. "I've brought trouble to your door. I should—" "If you say you should leave, I might lose my temper," he interrupted, turning to face her. "How many times do I have to say it? Your past is your past. We've all got one. You were a lawman. Deputy marshal for a while. It's not something I talk about." He set the rifle against the fence, ran a hand through his hair. "Saw too much, did too much. Came here looking for peace. Sarah helped me find it. And now I've destroyed that peace." "No." He moved closer, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip. "You've reminded me that some things are worth standing up for, that a man can't just hide away from the world and expect it to leave him be." "Calder." "I meant what I said to them. They come back, they'll regret it. But Leona—" He paused, seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "That night in Abilene, you don't owe me the story, but if there's something that might come back on us, I need to know." She looked down at her hands, still dirty from planting. "A cowboy got rough, wouldn't listen when I said no, followed me outside, pushed me against a wall. I had a knife in my boot, cut him enough to get away. He lived, but his pride didn't, made threats, said he'd see me hanged for assault. I left that night. Self-defense isn't a crime." "It is when you're a woman who works in a saloon, when the man you cut has friends and money and you've got nothing but your word." Calder nodded slowly. "If it comes to it, if someone tries to make trouble over that, we'll face it together. I've still got influence enough to ensure you get a fair hearing." The word slipped out before she could stop it. "You're not alone anymore. Leona takes some getting used to. I know. Took me a while to learn it when Sarah was alive. But you've got someone standing with you now, if you'll allow it." She looked at him, this quiet man who kept surprising her, who offered protection without asking for payment, who saw her as more than the sum of her worst moments. "I'm not used to allowing anything. Been making my own way too long." "I know, but maybe it's time to try something different." She turned back to her garden, needing something to do with her hands. "These seedlings need water." "I'll fetch the bucket." He started to walk away, then paused. "Leona, this place, it's better with you here. Just wanted you to know that." He left before she could respond, left her standing in the spring sunshine with dirt on her hands and something warm unfurling in her chest. The threats Jake had made still lingered, but somehow they seemed less frightening now. She'd faced down her past and found she wasn't facing it alone. As she went back to her planting, Leona allowed herself to think, for just a moment, about putting down roots of her own, about what it might mean to stop running, to stand her ground, to tend a garden and watch it grow in the shelter of a man who'd proven himself worth trusting. It was a dangerous thought, but as she pressed another seedling into the dark earth, she couldn't quite bring herself to uproot it. The trouble started on a Saturday afternoon in early June. Leona had ridden into Ash Hollow with Calder for supplies, their first trip to town together since Jake Tillman's threats. She had been reluctant to go, but they needed flour and salt. And Calder had insisted it was time to show her face, to not let fear keep her hidden away on the ranch. "We go about our business normal-like," he'd said that morning. "Show folks we've got nothing to hide." The ride-in had been pleasant enough, the wagon rolling smooth over the dry road, wildflowers blooming purple and yellow in the meadows. Calder had pointed out a hawk's nest in an old cottonwood, and she'd told him about the herbs she'd found growing wild near the creek, almost like an ordinary couple on an ordinary day. If not for the rifle tucked behind the wagon's seat and the way Calder's eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. Town was busy. Families in for Saturday shopping, ranchers loading supplies. At first, Leona thought the looks they got were just curiosity Calder Boone with a woman, after all these years alone. But as they made their way down Main Street, she began to catch the whispers, see the way women pulled their skirts aside as she passed. "At the general store, Mrs. Henderson's face went cold as winter when they entered. She served them, but with pinched lips and averted eyes, measuring out flour like it pained her to sell to them. Other customers stepped back, creating a circle of empty space around Leona as if what she had might be catching. "Will that be all, Mrs.?" Henderson asked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We need salt too," Calder said evenly. 10 pounds. "We're out." Leona could see the salt barrels behind the counter, clearly full. She opened her mouth to point this out, but Calder's hand on her elbow stopped her. "Then we'll take our business to Murphy's," he said calmly. "Good day, Mrs. Henderson." Outside, Leona's cheeks burned. "She had salt. You saw." "I saw. Everyone saw. That's what matters." Murphy's store was slightly better, he sold to them, though he charged prices that made Calder's jaw tighten. But it was at the feed store that things went from uncomfortable to ugly. Jake Tillman was there, holding court with a group of local men. His voice carried clear across the street as Calder loaded grain sacks. "Telling you, I knew her in Dodge. Worked at Big Jim's place, and not just serving drinks, if you catch my meaning. Had a reputation for being friendly with any man who had coin." "That's enough, Tillman." One of the men, Leona, recognized him as Carl Baxter, who ran cattle on the range north of Calder's place. Sounded uncomfortable. "Just think folks should know what kind of woman Boone's got living in his house." Jake continued, louder now. "Heard tell she left Kansas just ahead of the law. Something about a man who ended up cut pretty bad. Course, she probably told Boone a different story. Women like that, they're good at making men believe whatever they want to hear." Leona stood frozen beside the wagon, shame and anger warring in her chest. She wanted to march over there, to tell her side, to fight back against the lies. But she knew it would do no good. In the court of public opinion, a woman who'd worked in saloons had already been tried and convicted. "Stay here," Calder said quietly. And before she could respond, he was striding across the street. The group of men fell silent as he approached. Jake's smirk widened, but there was something nervous in it now. "Boone," he said, "we were just—" Calder's fist caught him square in the jaw, sending him sprawling in the dust. Gasps went up from onlookers who'd gathered to watch. Jake scrambled to his feet, hand going to his gun, but stopped when he found himself looking down the barrel of Calder's Colt. "Draw it, and I'll kill you where you stand," Calder said, his voice carrying that dangerous quiet she'd heard only once before. "In front of all these witnesses." "He assaulted me," Jake sputtered, blood running from his split lip. "You all saw—" "I saw a man defending a lady's honor from a lying coward," Carl Baxter said unexpectedly. "Anyone else see different?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Not everyone, Leona noticed. Some faces remained cold, judgmental, but enough to matter. "You've had your say, Tillman." Calder continued, "Spread your poison. Hope it was worth it, because now I'm done being civilized about this. You show your face near my property again, I'll shoot you for trespassing. You spread any more lies about Mrs. Jameson, I'll call you out proper, and unlike you, I don't miss." He holstered his gun, turned his back on Jake with deliberate contempt, and walked back to where Leona waited. The crowd parted for him, some with respect, others with fear. "We're done here," he said, helping her up onto the wagon seat. They rode out of town in silence, Leona acutely aware of the eyes following them. It wasn't until they were well clear of Ash Hollow that she trusted herself to speak. "You shouldn't have done that." "Hit him? Probably not. Felt good, though." Despite everything, she found herself almost smiling. "Your knuckles are bleeding." "Worth it." "Calder—" She struggled for words. "What Jake said about me being friendly with men for money. I don't care what Jake said." "You should, because now people think—" "Leona," he reined in the horses, turned to face her fully. I need you to hear this. Really hear it. I don't care what people think. I don't care what you did or didn't do in Kansas. I care that you make the best biscuits I've ever eaten. I care that you've got my horses trusting you like they haven't trusted anyone since Sarah. I care that you hum while you work and that you've made my house feel like a home again." The words hung between them in the afternoon sun. Leona felt tears threaten and blinked them back hard. "But your reputation?" "My reputation was as a hermit who'd given up on life. If folks want to gossip about me now, at least it means I'm living again." He picked up the reins but didn't signal the horses yet. "Question is, can you handle it? The talk, the judgment, because it's going to get worse before it gets better." She thought about the cold faces in town, the whispers that would follow her everywhere. Then she thought about the garden growing behind the house, the curtains in the windows, the way Calder's eyes lit up when he came in to find supper waiting. "I've handled worse," she said finally. "And I had to do it alone then." "Not alone now," he reminded her, and clicked to the horses. They were a mile from home when they saw the smoke, black and ugly against the blue sky, rising from the direction of the ranch. Calder cursed and slapped the reins, sending the horses into a run. The barn was engulfed when they crested the hill. Flames licked through the roof, smoke pouring from every opening. Leona's heart stopped the horses, but then she saw them, all four, running free in the far pasture, someone having had the decency to release them before setting the fire. They fought it with buckets from the well, but it was hopeless. The barn was old wood, dry as kindling, and the fire had too much of a head start. In the end, they could only stand back and watch it burn, watch 6 years of Calder's work turn to ash and ember. "I'm so sorry," Leona whispered. "This is my fault. Jake—" "This is Jake's doing, not yours." Calder's voice was grim but steady. "Building can be replaced. Stock's safe. We're safe. That's what matters." But she could see the loss in his eyes as he watched the flames. That barn had been built with his own hands, had sheltered his animals through countless storms. Now it was gone because of her, because she'd brought her past to his door. As if reading her thoughts, Calder put his arm around her shoulders. The gesture was so unexpected, so simply protective, that she found herself leaning into him without thinking. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't you dare blame yourself for the actions of cowards and criminals. We'll rebuild, together. Make it better than it was." They stood there as the sun set and the fire burned down. Two people who'd found each other through loneliness and circumstance, now bound together by something stronger. The town might whisper, Jake might threaten, but here on this piece of land, they'd make their stand. "Together," Leona repeated, testing the word, finding she liked the shape of it in her mouth. The barn was ashes by full dark, but the house still stood, windows glowing warm with lamplight. They had losses to count, work ahead, troubles still to face, but they had this too, a place to stand, someone to stand with, and the kind of stubborn courage that had settled the frontier in the first place. Tomorrow they'd start rebuilding. Tonight, they'd tend what they still had and be grateful it was enough. The letter was waiting on the kitchen table when Calder came in from checking the cattle. Leona stood beside the stove, her back rigid, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. One look at her face and he knew something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked, setting his hat on the peg. She nodded toward the paper. "Carl Baxter brought it by while you were out. Said a stranger in town asked him to deliver it." Calder picked up the letter, noting the careful handwriting, the lack of postal marks. It was addressed to Leona Jameson, nothing more. He looked at her questioningly. "Read it," she said, her voice flat. He unfolded the single sheet. Asterisk, Mrs. Jameson. Asterisk. Your past has finally caught up with you. The incident in Abilene has not been forgotten. There are those who believe justice was denied and seek to correct that oversight. You have brought shame and danger to the man who has sheltered you. If you have any decency left,
You will leave before more harm comes to him. The next fire might not be empty of life. Asterisk 1. Who remembers asterisk? Who remembers? Calder set the letter down carefully, controlling the anger that surged through him. Jake's getting desperate if he's resorting to anonymous threats. It might not be Jake. Leona's knuckles were white around the cup. The cowboy in Abilene, his name was Harlan Cross, had a brother who swore he'd see me hang. This brother have a name. Wade Cross? Last I heard, he was riding with a rough crowd down near the border. She finally looked at him, and the defeat in her eyes hit him like a physical blow. I have to leave. Calder, tonight, before... No. You didn't let me finish. Don't need to. Answer's still no. He moved to the stove, poured his own coffee with steady hands despite the fury building in his chest. We've had this conversation before. That was before they burned your barn, before they threatened your life. Her voice cracked. I won't have your blood on my hands. I won't. And I won't have you running scared into the night because some coward writes letters. He turned to face her. You think leaving will make you safe. Think they'll just forget about you if you disappear again. It's not about me being safe. Like hell it isn't. The words came out harsher than he intended. He took a breath, moderated his tone. Leona, men like this, they don't stop. You run now, they'll follow. You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, waiting for them to find you again. She set down her cup with shaking hands. Better that than watching them hurt you. You've been nothing but good to me, and I've brought nothing but trouble to your door. You've brought a hell of a lot more than trouble. He stepped closer, close enough to see the unshed tears in her eyes. You've brought life back to this place, to me. You think I'm going to let you walk away because some bastard makes threats? You don't understand. Don't I? Now his own voice cracked with emotion he rarely let show. 6 years ago, I held my wife while she died of fever, sat right here in this kitchen and watched her fade away. Couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. You know what that kind of helplessness does to a man. Know what it's like to have everything that matters ripped away and be powerless to prevent it. Leona's tears spilled over. Calder, I couldn't save Sarah, but I can damn well protect you. I won't sit by and watch someone else. He stopped, the words catching in his throat. I won't be helpless again, not when I can fight back. Someone else you would, she whispered. He met her eyes directly. Someone else I've come to care about more than I have a right to. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Leona pressed her fingers to her lips, trying to hold back a sob. I can't, she managed. I can't let you risk everything for me. I'm not worth... He crossed the space between them in 2 strides, caught her shoulders gently but firmly. You're worth it to me. When are you going to understand that? When are you going to stop believing you deserve to be alone and punished for surviving the only way you could... She broke then, the tears coming fully. He pulled her against his chest, feeling her shake with the force of emotions too long contained. His hand found her hair, still pinned up proper, and he held her while she cried out years of fear and loneliness and shame. I'm so tired, she whispered against his shirt. Tired of running, tired of being afraid, tired of being alone. Then stop, he said simply. Stay, fight, let me stand with you. She pulled back enough to look up at him. What if they come? What if it really is Wade Cross? Not just Jake trying to scare me? The Cross brothers have friends, dangerous men who... Then we'll face them. I told you before, I still have friends with badges. The territorial marshal in Denver owes me favors. We do this legal and proper. Get your side of the story on record. Make them prove their claims in front of a real judge, not some kangaroo court. And if they don't want legal, if they just come shooting... His smile was grim. Then they'll find out why I survived 5 years wearing a badge in towns where most deputies lasted 5 months. She searched his face. You'd do that, risk that for me. Leona. He cupped her face in his hands.
thumbs brushing away tear tracks. I do a lot more than that. Question is whether you'll let me. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then, slowly, she nodded. All right, I'll stay. We'll fight. Together. Together. He should have stepped back then, should have released her and returned to safe distance. Instead, he found himself leaning down, pressing his lips to her forehead in a gesture that was comfort and promise and something more. She sighed and relaxed against him, and they stood there in the kitchen with late afternoon light slanting through the windows. Two damaged people finding strength in each other. Finally, reluctantly, he let her go. I'll ride to town tomorrow. Send that telegram to Denver. Tonight, we'll move your things to the main room. What? You're not sleeping alone in that back bedroom anymore. Too vulnerable. You'll take my room, it's got better sight lines. Window faces the road. I'll bed down out here where I can watch both doors. Calder, we agreed. You'll keep your room. I keep mine. That was before someone threatened to burn us alive. His voice brooked no argument. Things change. We adapt. Unless what? He looked at her steadily. Unless you'd rather share. Safer with two people watching. Color flooded her cheeks. Calder Boone, are you suggesting... I'm suggesting safety in numbers. Nothing more or less than what you make of it. But there was something in his eyes that said he knew exactly what he was suggesting, and was leaving the choice to her. She turned away, busying herself with the coffee pot. We'll do as you said. I'll take your room. You take the main room. For now. For now. He agreed, hearing what she wasn't saying, what that for now might mean. That night, they worked together to secure the house. Calder showed her where he kept extra ammunition, walked her through sight lines from each window, made sure she knew how to bar the doors properly. They moved her few possessions to his room, and she tried not to notice how the space smelled of him leather and wood smoke and the particular soap she'd taught him to make. As the moon rose, Calder settled into his makeshift bed by the stove, rifle within reach. Through the thin walls, he could hear Leona moving around, getting ready for sleep in the bed he'd shared with Sarah, then slept in alone for 6 years. Calder, her voice came soft through the door. Yeah? Thank you for everything, for not letting me run. Thank you, he replied, for staying. Silence fell, but it was the comfortable kind, the kind that said some things didn't need words. Outside, an owl called, and the wind whispered through the grass where the barn used to stand. Tomorrow would bring challenges, telegrams to send, defenses to plan, maybe enemies to face. But tonight, they were together under one roof, no longer pretending this arrangement was just about work and wages. Tonight, they'd chosen to stand and fight rather than surrender to fear, and in that choice, something had shifted between them. Some wall had come down that wouldn't be easily rebuilt. Calder stared at the ceiling, listening to the small sounds of Leona settling for sleep, and allowed himself to admit the truth he'd been dancing around for weeks. He was falling in love with her. Maybe had been since that night by the water trough when she'd sat freezing rather than beg. The thought should have scared him. Instead, it filled him with a fierce determination. They wanted to come for her. Let them come. They'd find out what a man would do to protect the woman who'd brought him back to life. In the bedroom, Leona lay in sheets that smelled of Calder and made her own admission in the safety of darkness. She was tired of running, yes, but more than that. She was tired of being alone, and with this quiet, steady man who offered protection without price and caring without conditions. Maybe she didn't have to be. Tomorrow could bring what it would. Tonight, she was home. The first snow of the season came early that year, falling soft and silent on a night in late October. Leona woke to the peculiar quiet that meant the world had been transformed while she slept, through the window of what was still, technically, Calder's room. She could see everything covered in pristine white,
the burned foundation of the barn now hidden beneath nature's clean blanket. 3 months had passed since the night of the threatening letter. The territorial marshal had come and gone, taking her sworn statement about the incident in Abilene. Jake Tillman had been arrested for arson and intimidation, though he'd made bail and disappeared before trial. As for Wade Cross, the marshal's investigation had turned up interesting news. He'd been killed in a shootout near the Mexican border 2 years prior. The letter had been Jake's last desperate gambit, invoking a dead man's name to drive her away. With the immediate threat past, life had settled into new rhythms. They'd rebuilt the barn with help from Carl Baxter and a few other neighbors who'd decided that Calder's choice of company was his own business. The garden had produced abundantly, and Leona had spent weeks preserving vegetables for winter. The house now bore her touch in countless small ways: braided rugs on the floor, herbs drying from the rafters, a quilt she'd pieced together from fabric scraps covering the rocking chair. But some things hadn't changed. She still slept in his room while he kept watch in the main room. They still maintained careful distance during the day, employer and employed. Nothing more. The words he'd spoken that night about caring more than he had a right to hung unaddressed between them like morning mist, present but ungraspable. This morning, though, something felt different. Maybe it was the snow, making the familiar strange. Maybe it was the way the early light caught in the frost flowers on the window. Or maybe it was just that patience, hers and his, had finally run its course. Leona rose and dressed quietly, twisting her hair up with practiced movements. In the main room, she found Calder already awake, standing at the window with a cup of coffee, watching the snow fall. He'd let his hair grow longer as the months passed, and it curled slightly at his collar. She had to resist the urge to smooth it down. "Morning," she said softly. He turned, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. "Morning, sleep well." "Yes." She moved to the stove, grateful for something to do with her hands. "First snow early this year means a hard winter ahead." They fell into their morning routine. She started breakfast while he tended the stove, adding wood to chase away the chill. But there was an awareness between them, a tension like the air before lightning strikes. When she reached past him for the salt, her arm brushed his, and they both froze for a heartbeat before continuing. They ate in unusual silence, the weight of unspoken things growing heavier. Finally, Calder set down his fork with deliberate care. "Leona, we need to talk." Her heart stuttered, but she kept her voice steady. "About what?" "About this." He gestured between them. "About us pretending there's nothing here when we both know better." She folded her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Then tell me why you still say goodnight through a closed door every evening. Tell me why your hand shakes when you pour my coffee. Tell me why I catch you looking at me when you think I don't notice." Heat flooded her cheeks. "Calder, tell me why I lie awake listening for your breathing through the walls. Why I make excuses to work near the house just to hear you humming. Why the thought of you leaving makes me feel like I'm drowning." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest as that first night by the water trough. Leona found she couldn't look away from his eyes, gray as the winter sky outside. "What are you asking me?" she whispered. "I'm asking if you'd consider making this permanent, not the arrangement we have now, with you in one room and me in another, pretending we're nothing more than employer and hired help." He reached across the table, palm up, waiting. "I'm asking if you'd consider being my wife." The word hit her like a physical blow. Wife. She'd been a wife once, young and hopeful and ignorant of how much the world could take away. The thought of opening herself to that kind of loss again. "Calder, She stopped, swallowed hard. "What we have now works. Why change it?" "Because I'm tired of pretending I don't want more." "Aren't you?" She looked at his outstretched hand, calloused and strong and steady. How many times had she watched those hands work, Gentle with the horses, sure with tools, careful with her own things. How many evenings had she wanted to reach out and take that hand, feel those fingers intertwined with hers?
I'm scared,
she admitted, the words barely audible.
Of what?
Of losing again? Of not being enough? Of waking up one day to find this was all just another temporary shelter? The tears came then, silent but unstoppable. I've been temporary so many places. Calder, I don't think I could bear being temporary here too. He was around the table before she could blink, kneeling beside her chair, taking her hands in both of his. Look at me, please. She did, through the blur of tears. You could never be temporary. Not to me. From the moment you chose that water trough over compromising your principles. You've been working your way into my life like spring works into frozen ground, slow and steady and inevitable. His thumb stroked over her knuckles. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm not asking you to forget your past or pretend it didn't happen. I'm asking you to let me share your future.
What if?
No what ifs. We've had enough of those. Just tell me, do you want this too? Do you want me the way I want you? Looking into his eyes, Leona found she couldn't lie. Not to him, not about this. Yes, God help me, yes. His smile was like sunrise after a long winter night. Then marry me. Today, if we can find a preacher. Tomorrow if we can't. But soon, before either of us finds another excuse to wait. Calder, people will talk. Let them. They've been talking anyway. He rose, drew her to her feet. I'm done living my life by what other people think. Question is, are you? She thought about the months since she'd arrived. The slow building of trust, the quiet companionship, the way this house had become home without her quite noticing when it happened. Thought about the careful distance they'd maintained and how it had become its own kind of torture. The roads are probably impassable with this snow, she said. Probably. And Reverend Morrison only comes through once a month. True. And we don't have proper clothes for a wedding. Also true. He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. But none of that matters if you say yes. Yes, she breathed, and felt years of running finally come to a stop. Yes, I'll marry you. He cupped her face in his hands, and she thought he would kiss her then. Instead, he rested his forehead against hers, and they stood there breathing the same air, sharing the same space they'd been so careful to divide. Thank you, he whispered, for staying, for trusting, for taking a chance on a broken-down rancher who'd forgotten how to hope. Thank you, she whispered back, for offering a corner to sleep and never asking for payment, for seeing me as more than my worst moments, for reminding me I was worth fighting for. This time, when his lips found hers, it was like coming home after a lifetime of wandering, gentle and sure and full of promise, a seal on all the words they'd said and all the ones they hadn't needed to. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in fresh white. Inside, two people who'd found each other in loneliness discovered that together, they made something altogether new, not perfect, not without scars, but whole in a way neither had been alone. They'd share a bed that night, not for propriety or protection, but because the careful distance they'd maintained had finally become unnecessary. No more closed doors between them. No more pretending that employment was all that bound them together. And when spring came again, melting the snow and bringing new growth, Leona would plant her garden with the knowledge that she'd be there to harvest it, that this place, this man, this life they'd built from necessity and grown into love, all of it was hers to keep. But that was still to come. For now, there was just this a quiet kitchen, morning snow, and two people holding each other like they'd never need to let go. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Spring arrived in earnest, painting the valley in shades of green and gold. The wildflowers that had been mere promises when Leona first came to the ranch now bloomed in riotous abundance. Indian paintbrush, columbine, and prairie roses that climbed the new garden fence Calder had built. Reverend Morrison had finally made it through in February, performing a simple ceremony in the main room of the ranch house with Carl Baxter and his wife as witnesses, Mrs. Baxter had surprised them both by bringing a cake and staying to help serve the small wedding supper. "Everyone deserves a chance at happiness," she'd said quietly to Leona, "even those of us who've had to take difficult roads to find it." Now, 3 months married. Leona stood at the kitchen window watching Calder work with a new colt in the corral. The barn rising behind him was larger than the old one, built with future growth in mind. They'd added a proper tack room and a hayloft that could store enough feed for the hardest winter. The fire that had seemed like disaster had become an opportunity to build better, stronger. She pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling the slight swell that didn't yet show beneath her apron. She hadn't told him yet, was waiting for the right moment, though she suspected he'd already guessed. He'd been watching her with a particular intensity lately, noticing when certain smells made her queasy, when she tired more easily than usual. The sound of an approaching wagon drew her attention. A family was coming up the road, man, woman, and what looked like 3 children squeezed onto the seat. Travelers, by the look of their loaded wagon and trail-worn clothes. She stepped onto the porch as they drew near. Calder already walking over from the corral. The man pulled up, touched his hat. "Afternoon. Ma'am, sir, sorry to trouble you, but we're looking for the Boone Ranch. Fellow in town said you might have work available." Leona saw the hope poorly hidden in his eyes, recognized the particular desperation of a family running low on options. The woman beside him held a baby, while 2 older children peered out with curious eyes. "This is the Boone Ranch," Calder confirmed. "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Anything. Sir, I'm good with cattle, horses. My wife's a fine seamstress, can cook and keep house. We're not afraid of hard work." "Where are you coming from?" "Missouri, originally. Been trying to make it to Oregon, but—" The man's shoulders sagged. "Trail's been harder than we figured. Lost our stake in a river crossing, and we need to stop. Earn enough to continue, or maybe just stay somewhere." Leona stepped forward. "When's the last time your family had a proper meal?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "2 days, Mom. We've been making do with what little—" "Calder, why don't you show Mr. Hartley, James Hartley? Why don't you show Mr. Hartley the old bunkhouse while I get these children something to eat?" She was already reaching out to help Mrs. Hartley down from the wagon. "It's nothing fancy, but it's got a sound roof and a good stove." Calder caught her eye over the children's heads, and she saw his small smile. They'd talked about hiring help as the ranch grew, but she knew he understood this was about more than practical needs. This was about remembering what it felt like to have nowhere to go and finding someone willing to take a chance on you. An hour later, the Hartley family was settled around their kitchen table, the children eating like they hadn't seen food in a week. Mrs. Hartley Emma. She'd said her name was tried to help serve, but Leona waved her back to her seat. "Eat first. There's plenty of time for working later." "I don't understand," Emma said quietly. "You don't know us. We could be anyone." Leona met Calder's eyes across the room, remembering a snowy night and a water trough and a man who'd offered shelter without conditions. "Sometimes," she said, "folks just need a chance, a place to rest and gather strength before they decide what comes next." "The bunkhouse needs some fixing," Calder told James, "but if you're willing to help with that and the regular ranch work, we can offer wages plus room and board. See how it goes." "Yes, sir. Thank you. We won't let you down." After the Hartleys were settled in the bunkhouse, Leona and Calder stood on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. His arm was around her waist, her head on his shoulder. "That was a good thing you did," he said quietly. "We did. Together." She turned in his arms to face him. "Calder, I have something to tell you." He waited, patient as always.
I'm going to need to add another room to the house, a small one, for someone who'll be arriving around harvest time.
She watched understanding dawn in his eyes, followed quickly by joy so profound it took her breath away. He placed a trembling hand on her still flat stomach. You're sure? Very sure. I've delivered enough babies to know the signs. He pulled her close, buried his face in her hair. She felt him shake slightly and realized he was crying, this strong, steady man who'd faced down threats and fires, and her own stubborn resistance was undone by the promise of new life.
I thought I'd lost any chance at this,
he whispered. After Sarah, after the baby she was carrying when she died. I thought that part of my life was over.
Nothing's over,
Leona said, holding him tight.
It's just beginning different than we expected.
They stood there as darkness gathered. Two people who'd found each other at the end of their ropes and discovered that together they could weave something stronger. The ranch spread out around them, the new barn, the flourishing garden, the bunkhouse now sheltering another family starting fresh. It wasn't the life either of them had planned, but it was the life they'd built, choice by choice, day by day. No more sleeping on floors, Calder said suddenly. Leona pulled back to look at him, confused. What? That first night, you offered to sleep on the floor. I said I don't invite people to sleep on my floor. His hands framed her face, thumbs gentle on her cheeks. Want to make sure our children know that too. This house, this land, this life, it's for sharing, not hoarding. No one sleeps on floors here. Just in beds, she teased.
What if someone prefers the floor?
Then we get them a better bed, he said seriously. Everyone deserves a soft place to land. Leona, you taught me that. I think we taught each other. Later, as they prepared for bed in the room they now shared, Leona paused at the window. The Hartleys' bunkhouse showed lamplight through its windows, another small beacon of warmth in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a ranch to run, a family to help settle in, a baby to prepare for. But tonight, there was peace. She'd come to Ash Hollow with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate need for shelter. She'd asked for a corner to sleep in, a small space out of the cold. Instead, she'd been offered half a bed, half a life, half a heart that had somehow become whole in the sharing. Coming to bed, Calder asked from behind her. In a moment, she touched her stomach again, thinking of the child growing there, the life they'd created in this place that had become home. Just thinking about how far we've come.
Long way from that water trough,
he agreed, wrapping his arms around her from behind.
Long way,
she echoed. But not in miles in trust earned, in love discovered, in the simple daily choice to stay and build rather than run and hide. Through the window, stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky. The same stars that had watched over her during all those nights of running, all those temporary stops in places that wouldn't have her. Now they looked down on a woman who'd finally stopped running, who'd found not just a corner to sleep, but a whole life to live. And that, Leona thought as she turned in her husband's arms, was worth every hard mile traveled to get here. Every closed door had led to this open one. Every cold night had made this warmth sweeter.
I love you,
she said, words that still felt new and precious on her tongue. I love you too, he replied. Thank you for staying. Thank you for asking me to. They went to bed then, two people sharing space that had once been carefully divided, hearts that had once been carefully guarded. Outside, the ranch slept peaceful under starlight, the horses in their stalls, the Hartleys in their new home, the garden waiting for tomorrow's sun. And in the house that had sheltered a grieving widower and a desperate woman, new life grew, not just the child Leona carried, but the life they'd chosen to build together, a life where strangers were welcome, where past mistakes didn't define future possibilities, where a corner to sleep could become a home to share. It wasn't the ending either of them had expected when they'd stood by that water trough on a snowy night, but it was the ending they'd earned, one choice at a time.
one day at a time. One act of trust building on another until they'd constructed something worth keeping. And in a frontier where so much was temporary, that permanence chosen and cherished and carefully tended was its own kind of miracle. The kind that happened when two people decided that together was better than alone, and home was wherever they stood side by side. The lamp went out, the house settled into sleep, and somewhere in the darkness, a child's heart began its steady beat, the newest rhythm in a song of belonging that would echo through the years, proof that even the coldest winter could give way to spring, and even the loneliest hearts could find their way home. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to hear where you're enjoying this tale, whether you're listening while driving through the countryside, relaxing at home, or perhaps even somewhere in the American West where these stories took place. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and hit that hype button to help more people discover these tales of love, courage, and redemption in the Old West.